Good evening and welcome to this special broadcast. India and United States today held the Indo-US commercial dialogue that focused on providing a more enabling work environment to companies of both countries. CEOs of both countries identified areas of cooperation including energy, water, environment, information and communication technology, emerging technologies, digital infrastructure, promoting small businesses and manufacturing. US also decided to hold a trade wins event in India in May in order to promote SMEs. It also seems that the impact of talks this time was slightly muted. In the absence of US Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who could not make it to the talks due to bad weather back home. After a day of talks, several contentious issues remain, including US tariffs on steel and aluminium, possible withdrawal of GSP benefits for $5.6 billion worth of Indian exports. US, on the other hand, has been upset over new FDI guidelines and data localization norms. Also, no word on when the two sides would finally sign a trade package. Let's take this forward with our guest this evening. We're joined by Martin Howell, South Asia Bureau Chief at Reuters. Kamal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, will be with us. Aman Thakur, Research Associate at CSIS, is also with us. Martin, I'd just like to begin with you. Yesterday, we got information that Wilbur Ross will not be able to make it for talks. His visit will have to be scrapped because of bad weather back home. Do you think there's more to it than meets the eye?
Obviously, there were conspiracy theories to start with, that this was deliberate. But I think it really was genuine. He really was on the plane. And the weather has been, extraordinarily bad in the US. So I think we should take it at face value.
We should take it at face value. But Ambassador Kamal Sibal, I'd like to come to you. If I look at this press release from the Ministry of Commerce, I don't see too many takeaways. No word on the trade package, no word on all those contentious issues, no agreements as such. Why did the talks happen in this fashion? Do you think the absence of Wilbur Ross somehow muted the impact?
Well, I think it did. If Wilbur Ross had been here, there would have been a more substantive conversation with our Commerce Minister and others, and some of the contentious issues which you outlined in your comments would have been addressed, not necessarily in terms of finding solutions, but at least in clearing the atmosphere and improving the understandings between the two sides. Because we have a president in the United States who's very heavily focused on these issues. And he would have wanted to get a report back which would have indicated forward movement on some of the issues on which the Americans are pressing us. And if he hadn't received that, he can be quite unpredictable. So in that sense, yes, the American side has lost an opportunity, and we have also lost an opportunity in the absence of Wilbur Ross. But nevertheless, my own understanding, and I was just now somewhere where the Commerce Minister was there and the American side was there and the CEOs were there. And the feedback that I got was that actually the atmosphere was positive, and they didn't want the American side didn't want to raise any of the difficult issues at this stage. I think they'll take them up after the elections. So they wanted to actually look at what are the opportunities that exist and focused on those. So to that extent, the atmosphere was good. But behind the scenes, there are these American complaints about some of the issues which you have mentioned, on which actually there was no forward movement.
No forward movement. And I think Ambassador Kenneth just, while speaking to the press, there was an off-camera briefing. He said that these are issues, these are contentious issues, but they are discussed at another level. They were not discussed in the commercial dialogue. Aman, I'd like to get you in at this stage. There have been a lot of reports about how the US wants a clear roadmap from India on reducing that $22 billion trade deficit, and post the FDI guidelines and data localization norms, it seems that Washington may be wanting to turn the screws on India. Is that the sense you get in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, obviously from the policy front, there's been so much of discussion and sort of tension in the discussion. But if you look at the real numbers and actual trade, there's actually good news on that front. So in terms of U.S.-India goods trade going up at about 16.7%, and U.S. exports to India actually going at a faster rate. If you look at U.S. exports to India growing at 28.6% year on year, versus Indian exports to the U.S., which are just at 10.9%. So you are seeing that the main issue, which is, sort of deficit reduction, that's the trade deficit. That's been something that, bilaterally has been happening. U.S. exports to India are growing faster than Indian exports to the U.S. And so from an actual trade numbers perspective, that there is forward momentum there. But on the policy front, these issues, like you mentioned, data localization, the FDI rules, the revocation of GSP, these are all issues that have cropped up and sort of be going in an opposite direction where the numbers are telling us they should be going.
That's right. And this is the GSP benefits issue is one of the most contentious points. And I'd like to get in Martin here. Martin, Reuters had actually broken that story about the possibility of withdrawal of GSP benefits for India worth 5.6 billion worth of Indian exports. Why do you think that is likely to happen? When we asked our sources in the Commerce Ministry, they said that there is no formal communication, but there were also other sources who said that this is being discussed at another level.
I mean, the indications we have been getting are that very much it's being discussed, and that what happened with Amazon and Walmart, what happened with MasterCard and Visa, and what's happened with some of what's been going on with steel, Trump's comments about Harley and whiskey in the past. I mean, there is a bit of a build-up there of issues. And the administration may want to send India a message.
Yeah, so US might be wanting to send feelers or hints and build up pressure, but we're also joined by author and commentator Gurcharan Das. Mr. Gurcharan Das, thanks very much for speaking to CNBC TV 18. I believe you're attending that dinner of Indo-US CEOs. What's the mood out there? I get a sense that most of the CEOs today were talking about a more enabling work environment. And while these FDI guidelines, data localization, all these issues did not directly come up, they somehow figured indirectly. What is the tone and tenor of the conversation there currently?
Well, I think that we're just about to start the dinner, so I can't tell you in advance what is the mood, but all I can say is that India's trade relations with the United States have never been easy. And now that India has a 22 billion trade surplus, which is peanuts compared to the 566 billion that China has. But what you have in Mr. Trump is an unpredictable person. And India should not take anything for granted, and India should not sit on its high horse. And I think, as you just mentioned, I think U.S. is preparing for retaliation. It's preparing to remove India from the GSP. And that would be a terrible blow to our small companies, which are the labor-intensive companies, and will hurt jobs. I mean, Modi has already hurt jobs via demonetization. And this will be just adding to the woes. So this growing protectionism in India is a wrong policy. And what India, I mean, we have got this solar panels. I mean, India should really accept the U.S. position. This idea of data localization, I think that is also, it's nationalistic bunkum, because I don't trust the Indian bureaucracy taking over including on the data, and the e-commerce policy should be reversed. I think that it's created a non-level playing field, and if you're going to succeed in business and get foreign investment in the future, you need to create a level playing field. So I think we should give up on the nationalistic protectionism. Focus on job creation. Protectionism is not in India's interest. And frankly, those who are pessimistic,
do you also feel
they should? I beg your pardon?
Yeah. Do you also feel that the exemptions that we have been asking for from steel and aluminium tariffs in the United States, they are unlikely to come by anytime soon?
Yeah, I think that is correct. But the other thing is, I think that one of the failures of our government has been its failure on exports. I mean, exports, the fact is that we elected Mr. Modi because he promised high productivity jobs, and export is what creates those jobs. And India's exports were 314 billion when Mr. Modi came in, and now they're 300 billion. They've gone down. Whereas the potential for exports is huge because there's a $16 trillion trade in goods in the world, and India's share is only 1.7%. Just if you could take that to 2.2%, you would have achieved in, and Modi would have got re-elected. So
you're giving us the larger geopolitical picture as well.
I'm not in favor of protectionism. I think it hurts India in the end.
All right, Mr. Gurcharan Das, thanks very much for speaking to CNBC TV 18. I'd like to go back to Aman Thakur again at this point. Aman, we have been talking about how India has been making that effort to reduce the trade deficit. And today, several CEOs pointed out aerospace, oil and gas as possible and potential areas of cooperation. And they felt that these two areas will reduce the trade deficit in the coming years. What do you feel about this and other areas of cooperation?
Well, oil and gas is definitely one place where, the Indian side, especially, this is something the government has taken a step in by increasing imports of U.S. oil and natural gas and sort of making a specific decision that they're going to source from the United States. I think that's definitely been seen as something that is aimed towards addressing these claims of, the high sort of trade deficit that the Trump administration sees. And a deliberate step to try and, appeal to the United States is saying, look, we are taking steps in favor of doing this. And the same thing with aerospace. Obviously, you see, the aviation market in India growing so fast, both on the civilian side as well as the idea that we could source more airplanes for the military. That, too, is seen as an opportunity for the United States. So, I agree with that. But obviously, the big one here is oil and gas, because that's something that the government can take a decision on. Private sector can join on, but the government also is a key player on this. And that's a pretty big signal from the Indian government that, look, we hear your concerns, and this is an area that we know is important to you, and we can increase our imports of oil and gas from the United States at the same time as reducing the trade deficit, because that will bring that down.
Okay, and Ambassador Sibal, we have been hearing about a trade package for a while now. What are the sticking points, and why do you think both sides have not been able to go through with it? For the last few months, we were hearing that this trade package would be signed during the Indo-US Commercial Dialogue and CEOs Forum.
No, I heard Secretary Commerce Minister Prabhu say just now, a few minutes ago, that they're continuing to discuss the trade package, and he was very hopeful that this could be signed, but not immediately, obviously, because there are some differences that have to be bridged. I think on the American side, there is a lot of pressure, and there are too many, and there are demands, and which sound like quasi-ultimatums, that these are the issues on which you have to move forward, and that creates a resistance on the Indian side. Now, if one was to put it generally, what the Indian side would want are win-win situations rather than one-sided pressure where you have to yield to American demands in full. The Americans are frustrated because they are saying that they have been discussing this issue now for a couple of years or even more, and they have not seen adequate progress. And on top of that, new issues have come up, like in the case of e-commerce and data localization, which is then fouling up the atmosphere more and more. But I think that the American pressure on India on the deficit is excessive. I mean, they have to look at India's larger trade picture and not simply say that we will segment it only and look at it from the American point of view, and not look at the fact that from $20 billion of trade, bilateral trade in 2001, it has reached $130 billion. So look at the kind of progress that has been made. And with India now becoming...
We'll look at the larger picture.
Hoping to become a $5 trillion economy by 2025, there are huge opportunities for American companies in India. But unfortunately, Trump is far too focused on the immediate, on petty issues, and that is why the atmosphere is not very congenial for resolving.
And why is that, especially when the Indo-US trade deficit is minuscule compared to the US-China trade deficit? And that's a question we will put to Martin. Earlier today, I was tracking the meeting of the CEOs, the Indo-US CEOs, and the commercial dialogue, and I caught up with James Tyslit of American Tower Corporation, who is also the co-chair of the Indo-US CEO Forum. Here's an excerpt of that interaction.
The key takeaways from the CEO's Forum.
I would say, first of all, both from the government and the company's points of view, very collaborative, very constructive. We have a 2-year program that we're intending to put in place, and the goal really at the end of the day is to improve jobs and improve the conditions and the economies of both countries jointly.
Have both sides, have CEOs from both countries been able to identify areas which we can use to reduce the trade deficit?
Yes, actually, so there'll be some natural updraft from aerospace industry. Commercial aerospace sales to India will probably go up from the U.S. dramatically. Also in oil and gas, so that will naturally move up. And then some of the industry groups that we have in place now, manufacturing, ICT, etc., are going to explore ways where we can improve trade and increase the total and also even up the proportions a little bit better.
The recent FDI norms that India brought in, where it said that e-commerce players like Walmart, Amazon, or any foreign company for that matter, cannot hold equity in a particular item or a seller, that has really impacted a lot of e-commerce players in the country. Do you think this, coupled with data localization norms in India, that is something that concerns US companies?
I'll say that at this point it is a bit of a concern, but given the kind of collaborative atmosphere, I think these are the kinds of issues that both governments are willing to work through with industry, and we'll see where we land, and we'll accommodate, you know, the important issues for government and also try to address what will work for business. I think we'll get there.
And my final question would be, which are some of the areas you think that the Indian government needs to work on in order to probably improve the ease of doing business and manufacturing in India, and also investment in India?
Well, under the administration currently in place in India, there's been dramatic improvements on ease of doing business. And things such as, and they'll continue to improve, I believe, things such as the certainty and consistency of policies, you know, the communication of those broadly and, you know, sort of understandably. Those are the kinds of factors that are going to improve the ease of doing business even further over the next few years.
All right. Thank you very much for speaking to CNBC TV 18.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, that was James Tyslit, the chief of the American Tower Corporation. He's the co-chair of the Indo-US CEO Forum. And let's go back to our guest, Martin. I'd like to ask you, we were speaking to the chairman of the American Tower Corporation, and he said in the end that we need certainty, consistency, and better communication of policy. Do you think this is probably what irks American companies the most at this stage?
I think when you talk about the e-commerce guidelines, regulations, the biggest problem of all was the short timetable. What was it? About 5 weeks before the new rules came in, and they came in. They were announced over the holiday period in the US. I think that really, from what we've heard from executives and those working with them, that really irked them, because it is a little bit it's a little bit like the way China behaves, and I think you know that there is some historical context there. I mean, India might be a small market at the moment for American companies relatively against China, but 10, 20 years down the road it could be very different, and I think Trump is determined not to make those same mistakes.
That's right. And just to take that forward with Ambassador Sibal, we have been talking about withdrawal of GSP benefits, and Gurcharan Das felt that this was inevitable. What do you think will be the impact on the Indian economy if that happens anytime soon? And will it happen anytime soon?
Well, I think it will be a gross mistake on the part of the United States to do this, particularly at this moment. I think nobody really knows whether they'll actually do it or not, or it's just pressure tactics. the assessment on our side is that if worse comes to worse, it will not have that much of an impact on our trade, and maximum trade that might be affected would amount to about $230 million. So I don't think that there is that great concern on the Indian side about withdrawal of GSP benefits in terms of their actual impact on our exports. Concern is the message that it sends and the symbolic part of it, which would be quite negative in terms of the kind of atmosphere they're trying to build up between India and United States. And we would have gone back to this kind of policy of economic sanctions and the US laws and everything else. Besides the fact that the GSP benefits are part of the WTO arrangements, and there are people who say that legally speaking, actually GSP benefits cannot be withdrawn because of the WTO commitments of the United States. But yes, the United States can unilaterally do that. I think too much is being made about the economic cost of the GSP benefits, but the political cost would be considerable, particularly if this happens before the elections. I don't think the United States would be well advised to do this before the elections, because that can give a big jolt to the kind of confidence and the atmosphere that we're trying to build up in our relationship. And I must also conclude by saying that I had also had a conversation or had a chance to be present at a meeting where the US chairman on the CEO Forum side was very positive, very balanced, very mature, looking forward, talked about a 2-year program of addressing these issues, no hurry, no need to push India unnecessarily, find win-win situations, cooperative situations. That's a very positive message that the US side, at least at the head of the CEO Forum, was sending.
That's right. And Aman, to get in on this, as our panelists have been pointing out that India is heading to elections, as the conversation this time at the commercial dialogue, and this was a much awaited commercial dialogue, we thought that there would be a lot of takeaways, but there weren't too many. There's hardly any agreement that has been signed. Do you get a sense that now the US government does not want to engage with India on any big trade issue or sign any big agreement till the time the elections are over and they know who is in power in the next government?
Well, I think, I think that at least, meetings happening and progress and discussions be taking place, I think that's significant in itself. But I think in the past, if you look, the United States and India have had some major agreements, that are being signed before elections. Obviously, the big one is, in 2009, in the Manmohan Singh government, obviously the 123 agreement and the nuclear deal coming just before elections, that was something significant. So it's not like the U.S. government does not engage with India before the elections. But I will say that, since we're on the topic of elections and tying back to the question that you gave to Foreign Secretary Sybil, obviously the GSP, if that's revoked, that will have a big impact on the elections, I think, from an economic perspective as well, just given the types of sectors that are involved in sort of the GSP benefits. Out of the $5.7 billion of benefits that India gets, textiles and jewels are among the biggest. India is the third largest supplier to the U.S. on textiles, and U.S. accounts for 50% of India's gem and jewels exports. So, those two sectors, if they get impacted just before the elections, that spells some trouble as well for, the U.S.-India relations and the economic relationship there. They'll really impact small and medium business owners that are dependent on these benefits and exports to the U.S.
All right. I'll just take some final comments now. Martin, if I ask you for your headline based on today's press release, what would that be? And two concessions that the US would probably immediately want from India.
I would say it was papering over the cracks today, just trying to get on and get beyond the election. One thing I would point out, though, is we have the US-China trade talks before the election. Those will be resolved one way or the other. So that is also very important for us to consider. And two concessions that what India could give to get things going in a faster way. I mean, I think that there's going to be some issues coming up with the whole question of liability for internet companies. for content, and that could be another issue down the road that could cause some tensions. And I think they, if they could in some way work with the e-commerce companies to make it easier for them to restructure to cope with the new guidelines.
All right. Thanks very much, Martin. Thanks very much, Kamal Sibal, and thank you very much, Aman Thakkar, for joining us. This is the big story that we would be tracking over the next few days, and let's see how soon India and US can finalize that trade package. Thanks for watching.